Hello, everyone. My name is Mahmoud MOHIELDIN. I'm very pleased and honored to have the opportunity to moderate this discussion today, and I'll have the tough job of being the timekeeper as well. I'm a special envoy on financing the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, special envoy of the Secretary General of the UN. And I'm speaking to you now from my home country in Egypt. I'm very pleased and honored to have very distinguished speakers with us, with great deal of contribution to the topic that we're discussing today. Many good proposals, approaches, ideas that they have been floating around in their own domains, and using as well the platform of WAAS to do that, and to which we are all affiliated one way or another. But we're addressing the topic of the moment, which is basically about the global system with a focus on the global financial architecture, the monetary system, and which is affecting the way that we're conducting the substance of the work. If we're worried about growth, development, how to invest in human capital, in education, on health, how to fight poverty, how to deal with infrastructure finance, how to invest in digital transformation, how to deal with climate change. For that, we need a system that can help us dealing with that. Just a couple of weeks ago, Spain hosted us on the Finance for Development conference in Seville, which is the fourth international conference. The previous ones took place. The first one was in Monterrey in Mexico. The second one took place in Qatar, in Doha, Qatar. And the third one was exactly 10 years ago in Addis Ababa, discussing how to mobilize public-private finance, domestic and external resources, dealing with science, technology, and innovation, dealing with issues of challenges of debt and debt management, and dealing with trade. This conference was no different in terms of the topics, because we inherited these topics since Monterrey. But what's different is the fact that we're living in a fast changing world with very interesting dynamics, with tough geoeconomics and geopolitics, with incumbent powers trying to keep the power and maintain it and enhance it, with emerging powers trying to find a place under the sun with adequate access to resources, with a share in the governance. So my expectation from the great panelists we have today with us, and all of them, as I said, need no introduction, is not to highlight the crises or the problems, unless in trying to establish a kind of a context in which they are trying to provide the solutions to. And for that, we are trying as much as we can, while each one of them has a particular area of focus and specialization. We'll try at the end to see what could be more or less the cross-cutting kind of recommendations of reform. Trying to understand more issues of deficiency of architecture and system, especially in monetary and finance aspects. The discussion is not new. Some of us have read many of these proposals since actually the Bretton Woods system until now. After each crisis, from the emerging market crisis and the global financial crisis, some of us may have read the good work of the late Andrew Crockett, who used to chair the BIS, and he was an IMF member of staff and many other things. And he worked in the public sector and the private sector, in which he described, when we try to talk about architecture or a system, he said it could be a kind of exaggeration of description of the word. It could be less than a system, but a kind of a collection of arrangements that have formed whatever we have today. So, which makes matters even more difficult for those who are trying to see one or two mishaps or irregularities or inefficiencies in what's so-called the system. Anyways, let me start with the first panelist, as came in the order of the speakers list. We have with us Stefan BRUNNHUBER. He's a medical director and a trustee of WAAS, but very interesting as well to see that he has been contributing a great deal to reforming the monetary system, and have interesting ideas some of us could be familiar with, but perhaps we could be very much interested as well if he can really give us a kind of a background in his work on that before getting into the brief definition of the problem that we're trying to solve, or the crisis rather that we're trying to fix, and how to go about it. So Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you very much for having me. I would like to share one slide with you, if that's okay. I'm just finishing my term at the Governmental Board on Finance to the German government in spring this year. And I just want to share some of the aspects of discussions we had over the last years in one way or another. There's a timeline on the one side, and then there's the vertical axis. A is where we are in. This is the way we look at it. We look at economics in booms and busts, and up and down, up and down. C is where we want to be, right? It's a more regenerative, cyclical economy. At the moment, what we're doing is we're rather hitting D, where volatility indexes are rising, where instability is rising, and we end up in a Pareto inferior equilibrium, which is probably not the end of the world, but which is the end of the world as we've seen it, right? If you look at A again, which is more extractive, or 80% of the entire value chain globally is still depending on fossil in one way or another. The four major approaches, like implementing new technology, implementing new taxation schemas, implementing new taxonomies like ESG, we got involved in that on a large scale during the last years, and implementing transfer payments basically got debunked over the last couple of months through the American government. And the question is, how can we get from A to C? What is required as an out-of-the-box approach beyond technology, beyond taxation, beyond the taxonomies we're using already? They're all valid in themselves in order to reach C, right? And the best and fastest way to do, I think, is that we provide the market with an additional conditioned liquidity assistance. We're actually confronted with three paradoxes. On one side, we have a lot of private capital on the market, where 80% of the shift from A to C depends on private capital mobilization. On the other side, we're exposed to systemic risks, where the private capital is actually rather risk averse and withdrawing from getting invested. And thirdly, we are confronted with the fact that our planetary commons are basically chronically underfunded, right? So the shift from A to C in this graph is the shift we all want to be in. And one of the major, I think, puzzles or aspects of the puzzles that are missing is that we need the regulators be more involved. And the best and fastest way to do that, to unleash private capital on one side, to fund and hedge systemic risks, and to tackle underfunded global commons, is to provide additional monetary supply aggregate, best done by regulators. And this had been happening in China over the last years, and this is happening partly in Europe during the pandemics. And this is partly will very likely to happen over the next years. When we enter next year, the ECB new regulatory framework on central bank digital currencies, and their swap lines. The keyword I would like just to drop in order to go into the discussion is we might need a green QE in order to unleash private capital, to de-risk systemic risks and to fund our commons. This is 4 minutes for a complex topic.
Yeah, very much so. We'll come back to that. I wonder if you can just keep the slide for a second, because that could encourage reaction to it.
Yeah.
Because there could really be this kind of generous assumption that we can gradually move from wherever we are and go up to that warranted level without the complexity or the case. So what's preventing us from going from A to C without the complexity and the chaos? This is one, because the idea there is just to follow a smoother trend up to C, rather than getting from that kind of a level to a shift to a C. So you can just go gradually up. So what's preventing us from this kind of an assumption, unless it has very great deal of generosity, again, about collaborative models and being more resourceful and more cooperative than what we are. This is one. The second is basically about your proposal for another QE, or understand to be another quantitative easing. How can we maintain it without really going through a tough inflationary cycle more than what we have seen during the times of QE? I see you shaking your hands, which could be a start.
No.
The debate.
Well, wonderful.
Okay.
Let's start with the second. Let's start with the second question, Mahmoud, because this is the most important questions addressing conventional macroeconomists. The CPI, the harmonized CPI, will rise under the committed costs we triggered already anyway, right? The systemic risks ahead, they're going to happen anyway. The question is not whether the CPI is rising or not. The question is whether the CPI rising is to the extent we have to expect, or can we implement a mechanism that potentially lowers the CPI to rise to the expected, price level. Meaning, if we are able to fence in with this green QE mechanism, with a lot of associated facilities involved, the rise of externalities ahead, we are already on the right side of history, right? With regard to the first question, I think the shift from A to C is not a linear one at all. It is going to be a complex, chaotic one. The question is just, how can we ride complexity? How can we ride uncertainty? And I just phased out from the panel on systems risks and existential risk. We cannot fully quantify these system risks, right? The question is, how can we deal with this sort of uncertainty? And I think the fastest and at the same time cheapest way to do it is to have regulators on board beyond all the stuff we've been already facing, like taxonomy and taxation and technology.
Very good. Thank you so much for the explanation. We'll come back to it definitely, especially if we have more time. So let me turn now to Professor Dragan DJURCIN. Has been doing a lot and written extensively on areas related to vulnerabilities, especially on post-transition economies and the risks of rent-based financialization. And well, you have your 4 minutes to use them in the best you like.
Stefan is unexpectable, as always, and inescapable. It's not easy to discuss about route from A to C. Many theoretical arguments exist behind this concept, but I will back to my understanding of the problem. Before I continue, let me express my sincerely thanks to organizers of this event for making this panel of let me say, go-ahead group of luminaries from the finance sphere. Before I continue, also, I'd like to remember you that since the beginning of the neoliberalism, more than 4 decades before, sudden and massive seizures have gripped the world economy. Approximately about 1 every 10 years. In the same period, we're witnessing more than 450 economic crises of smaller size, but with contagion. With every consecutive crisis, macro-financial performances have been deteriorating. For example, the debt burden, both sovereign and private, have increased, amounting today to more than 4 times of global yearly GDP. This is conundrum. So discussing the road from A to C is difficult, particularly keeping in mind that you have many structural imbalances by design of the system. You have named these external asymmetric shocks, like bio feedback loops, like climate change, like geopolitics and militarization. So the time of buying a time and playing the game with policy measures inside the contours of neoliberalism and market fundamentalism, with Catholic impact of geopolitics, is definitely over. Polycrisis requires polytransition. We find generic term green transition. With triple dividend. First, it can stop the current cycle of crisis after the crisis. Second, it is capable of making net zero turning point possible in some period of time, maybe 2050, but we will see. And third, pushing toward economic and social revival of the economy and pushing economy on sustainable path. Fundamental change in policy platform is related to greater role of structural policies or industrial policies and macroeconomic stabilizers in fiscal and monetary sphere, which means that financing out of private sector will dominate creation of funds for green transition. McKinsey in 2022 projects that in a period between 2021 and 2050, green transition will require amount of 275 billion of euros, trillion of euros, which is about 7.5% of world GDP. The last projection last year coming to 15% of global GDP.
Yeah.
We have this PATEL search, these sources. We have these sources in private sector, but risk aversion of private sector regarding this topic is too high. So we need alternative sources. Impact investment based on new taxonomies and industrial policies, green credits and bonds based on sovereign debt, fiscal measures, stimulus and carbon taxes, Also market-driven measures like emission trading system and CBAM, typical for the EU market. Also, I agree with Stefan, austerity measures could be the source of financing, and philanthropy and other. My final point, new models of financing green transition are important. We need multi-track approach, but finance is not enough for its own. It provides some guidance. Financing should be based on fundamental debriefing of the system of values and build-up of self-confidence related to new taxonomy as normative judgments of decoupling well-being from uncontrolled exploitation of limited natural resources, namely with idea how circular model of growth and so-called heterodox economic policy approach with a major role of the state in economy will operate. Thank you. In this circle.
Thank you so much. I agree with you that finance alone will not do it. The reference to excellent work by Esther Duflo, the Nobel Prize laureate, she mentioned especially areas of crises among the polycrises that we're dealing with in climate change or in development crisis. You need three things. You need definitely finance, but you need with it the technological change, and you need behavioral change. And the behavioral change here will be responsible for leadership at the top or areas related to behavioral change through incentives, including to governments, local authorities, and private sector. We'll come back again to these excellent points, but after these excellent remarks by both of you, thank you, Stefan and Dragan, I'd like again to remind ourselves about what kind of a problem that we are trying to solve. Is it a kind of a cyclical kind of a problem because of the political cycles? Or is it a kind of a structural issue that we know more or less how can we deal with it? Or is it, as I understood it from our two distinguished speakers just now, it's more than that. It's a kind of a systemic shift, the shift from A to C, and the kind of shifts perhaps through softer pathways, difficult but not impossible, as mentioned by Dragan. So let me now turn to Frank DIXON. Has been, at least by the impressive title he is affiliated with, including with WAAS as well as a fellow, but he is systems change investing founder. So let's see in that. How can we benefit from that kind of work to solve the few problems highlighted so far? Frank.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud. It's a pleasure to be here with you and other financial leaders to discuss such a critical subject as global financial reform. I would, in this short conversation, can't say a whole lot, but I think one point I would make is that there's two different levels of work to improve the financial system. One could be what are practical strategies that we can do under current systems and involving technology, alternative currencies. These are usually going to be the number one strategy, but that probably won't be enough. We also need to step back and look at the big picture and do whole system approaches, which is the foundation of WAAS. A key question is, why is our financial system and other systems plus society overall unsustainable? And the main answer is our reductionistic thinking. We don't look at the big picture. We look at parts of the system, develop economic and political systems based on this limited view, ignore relevant factors, and come up with systems that produce unintended consequences like widespread environmental and social degradation. So the solution, like Einstein said, and the basis of WAAS for 65 years, is higher level whole system thinking. So in terms of how in terms of my comments, first I want to frame it up with some big picture work that needs to be done. And then either in this part or in my second question, I'll address a practical financial sector strategy for driving the types of systemic changes we'll be discussing on this panel. One of our systems, if we ask why the SDG problems exist, the main reason is that our systems compel them. And one way to think about the flaws of our current systems is to contrast the well-being of individuals to corporate well-being. Individuals largely are held responsible for harm through murder, assault, robbery, and other laws. So individuals can live the best life by causing no harm and ideally helping other people. The situation is largely the opposite for corporations. They are held responsible for some harm, but they're not held responsible for extensive environmental and social harm, such as climate change, toxic chemicals, poverty, wages, misleading the public through deceptive media. They're not held responsible for many types of harm. So while individuals can maximize their well-being by causing no harm, if companies try to do that, they'll go out of business. I was the head of research for the largest ESG research firm for many years and saw that no company, regardless of what they did, regardless of their good intentions, could get anywhere near sustainability. They could only mitigate about 20% of their negative impacts profitably. Beyond that point, if they continued to mitigate, their costs would go up and they would put themselves out of business. So the main reason that climate change and other SDG problems exist is not, as implied in the ESG movement, that they don't have the right strategy. And if we get companies to have a better strategy, that will solve climate change. The reason they're causing climate change is because our systems unintentionally say cause climate change and other SDG problems or cease to exist. And so when we ask companies to stop causing climate change under current systems, we're essentially asking them to die. And that's why climate change and other problems have gotten rapidly worse despite ESG and corporate sustainability becoming mainstream. So we need to shift the focus to changing systems and to change the financial system with a whole system approach. You can't do that in isolation because this financial system is part of the economic and political system, which is part of society, which is part of nature. So a whole system solution looks first at what nature demands of humanity, next of what sustainable society looks like, next then what does the economic and political system look like to support a sustainable society, and finally, what is the financial system needed to support a sustainable economy? So I'm advising Pensions for Purpose on system change. And one of the distinctions that I suggest they consider is the difference between system change and incentivizing system change. Evolving our systems into sustainable forms is massively complex. That's probably the major barrier to doing so. But what I suggest to them is that don't focus so much on that. Focus more on incentivizing system change. So, and if we think about what's happening in the world now with rapidly growing problems, it seems that we've entered a phase of system changes. Our systems are changing now, whether we like it or not. And if we don't voluntarily begin to try and drive that change, they're going to continue to decline in a way that will significantly disrupt business, investors, and society. So probably only the corporate and financial sectors have the power to drive voluntary system change. They're largely controlled by investing. So a practical strategy for driving financial sector reform and other types of systemic changes is to use the capital markets to incentivize companies to engage in system change. If we can use investing to get them to use their resources and power to drive system change, that's probably one of the most powerful levers available to humanity. So, and that's a very practical and relatively easy approach that I'll pause here, and in the second question, I can go into detail about how to do that.
Yeah, hope that we'll have time to cover all of that. But again, we can see crises everywhere, but not in the financial sector. We see crisis in climate, we see crisis in development, we see crisis, we saw crisis in health, and we're still under threat of another pandemic to hit us. There is definitely a crisis in debt facing many developing economies. But meanwhile, the financial sector and the financial markets are not really suffering from any major problem, let alone a crisis. I'm saying that because what you mentioned now, Frank, if we are going to have this kind of change, normally the change will happen because of one of two things. There could be a crisis, and then we can call it a good crisis to benefit from it. And unfortunately, we didn't benefit sufficiently well from the last crises that we faced, including the global financial crisis in 2008. And then, or through what you are saying, that there could be some incentives to the good that could really reform the financial sector and the capital market. But quoting some of my friends in the financial sector, some of them had it fantastically well, and they just need to keep it that way. So should we wait for a crisis to happen, or some wise people like you and Bob Schiller in the past and others could say, well, let's do something better now? But I'm not seeing the leadership pushing that. Regulators want to make it as stable as we wish it to be. Political leaders are struggling with the idea of central bank independence, as we see it in the US. We'll come back to you. I see you eager to jump on that reaction, but let's hear from Ketan Patel, who has been doing a lot in different areas with many hats, including advising the UN system, including with the business sector in many aspects and ways, and of course here with his important role as a trustee of WAAS. But given your involvement on the SDGs since the start, how can we link these financial sector reforms, monetary reforms, shifts from A to C, evolution or revolution, to getting the SDGs back on track?
Thank you, Mahmoud. And it's a delight to be on this WAAS panel with such a good group and many people I know who are friends too. I'm going to draw on a few things. One is our Force for Good work looks at the systemic changes in the world and in the shift of eras between the industrial era and where we are now, which is in the midst of change towards the information era. We also do some very deep analysis on the flows of capital to understand where is money coming from, who owns it, and where is it going. And we look at technology to see if technology is making the impact that we feel it is and should be making in the world. Firstly, my reflection is, I think every panelist has touched on the need for systemic change. And it makes absolute sense because the current global system of capital is not designed to serve the world. It was designed to serve industrialists and countries that wanted to build colonies all around the world. And so those two were fused and combined as merchant traders who went around the world, usually backed by capital from their sovereigns, raised on rudimentary markets in those days, but were taking risk capital to everywhere in the world to trade. It is an industrial and colonial model, therefore, of capitalism. It accrues wealth to those that own the capital and those that take the risk who are allocated some of that capital. So by nature, the system has been honed over 200 years to be enormously effective at doing that. And technology especially, and the globalization of the financial platform allows it to be superb at the mission that it was set. It is resilient, it is optimistic, it understands risk, it is using technology to trade almost every event, and it understands how to extract value and create value. It is one of the most defining survival of the fittest systems that has arisen out of the industrial era. So that's part one of what I would have as kind of accept or understand as we move forward. The second is a feature of it is therefore income inequality. It doesn't expect to enrich the people who don't have capital or assets in the first place. So its defining feature is this income inequality. So it makes sense that in a system like that, just 50%, the bottom 50% only have 2% of the wealth. It makes sense because that is the system. It makes sense that 165 million people fall into poverty since 2020. It makes sense that it doesn't matter whether it is war, trade, migration, debt. The system adapts understands the inefficiencies, understands what it should finance, and continues to be resilient. That is the system of the industrial era. So the SDGs, the world signed up to the SDGs. The financial system was not really a participant to say, do we sign up? But they saw the direction and they did sign up. And they were enormously optimistic about funding the SDGs. I think 2026 was a watershed moment at the COP in Glasgow, where they looked at it and they said, we can fund this shift in the world. We recognize where it's going and we will fund it. And they put down the plans to do that. I think that was gradually shaken until the confidence was lost, and until actually the leader of the financial system, the US, but the US government decided that it was not in the interests of ordinary Americans to fund development in other parts of the world. We recalculated what it takes to fund that gap based on extracting value from the current system, which is part of what Frank, I think, was saying. That's one thing you can do. You know, it's very expensive. It's $14 to $17 trillion. It's about 15% or so of annual GDP. That value is not voluntarily going to shift anywhere. And at the same time, poverty is rising in richer countries, and politicians face the pressure of addressing that. And then if you add on top of that, that the system has been weaponized to extract value from the world towards America, and capital flows are expected to reverse slowly back to America. And as we know, America has lost a huge amount of flow. If you measure it between 1970 to 23, America's share of the global GDP went down from 38% to 24%. The EU in the same period, so America lost 14% of its global share, and the EU lost 7%. And the beneficiaries were actually the global south, in particular China, and somewhat India. And India continues to gain share. If we look at the two that gain share, what did they do? They opened and liberalized their markets. They became active participants in the global markets. They created policy changes that infused dynamism in some sort in their own economies, and they created huge giants in their own countries. There is a formula there that says if you shift policy, you can actually create value and you can take share away from the global north. But I don't believe that that is the full answer. We are in this transition of eras, and the system we have, the financial system, is an industrial one, and the other one hasn't been born. What we do know is that if the Industrial Revolution is true and holds true going forward, when you get a massive technological shift that changes value creation, your GDP goes up something like 10x. Mm-hmm. And we should expect that something way north of 10x will happen in this next era, given the range of technologies that we're beginning to make breakthroughs on, which cover everything from technologies such as AI, but quantum technologies of various sorts, but also energy technologies. And so these breakthroughs do bring the dawn of a completely different era in financial system. I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to hand it back because we can have a dialogue about it, because I do see the shifts that we can make, I think, if we look at the world through that lens.
Right. So we have a great deal as well of knowledge to gain from cases and practice, and the reference to countries like India. There is an interesting piece I read it the other day by Raghu under the title of Save Us from Our Champions, in which he highlights the celebration, of course, of India to become number 3 ahead of Japan and Germany, to be number 3 after the US and China. So at the same time, the issue of competition, at least at the global level, is still leaving a lot to be desired with some of the big names. But this is a model that's a bit different from what I had been highlighted so far. But let me go back to Frank, because I don't think that it was fair to him, because I gave him the question. I didn't give him the adequate time, or no time actually, to react, but I bet that he will have good answers to it. And then I'll go to Stefan, and then to Dragan, and then back to you, Mr. PATEL. Frank?
Thank you, Mahmoud. And thanks everybody for your great comments. It's hard to cover such a complex subject in such a short time. Maybe just I want to briefly respond to your point, your excellent point, Mahmoud, that you made. You said your friends in the financial sector are doing very well, and asked the question why, the problems aren't in our sector. We're doing fine. And that's a major challenge because if we don't get vested interest, those with the power and the resources to drive change, to drive it, it's probably not going to happen. And the reality is that the financial sector is not separate from the rest of society. A lot of the growth in the capital markets is based on environmental and social degradation, concentration of wealth, and we know that that will not continue forever. And given how rapidly problems are growing right now, it seems highly likely that the capital markets are reaching a kind of limit of being able to grow based on degradation of that which supports them. So we have two choices then. If the people in the financial community say, well, I'm doing fine, we're making record profits, typically they block systemic change, and if they block it, it's probably not going to happen voluntarily. And if we wait until things crash and we feel the pain that you talked about, we might not have a lot of options left. And also, it could be the most disruptive that humanity has ever experienced because we're larger and more interconnected than ever before. We're at or beyond many environmental and social tipping points. So there's no guarantee that if we wait until we crash to turn things around, that we'll be able to do it. Or it's going to. So the real challenge then is how can we get those in power to work now when they're doing very well under current systems. And I think the model for doing that is ESG. With ESG, over the past 25 years, we got companies through the capital markets to take care of the environment and society. It provided a lot of benefits. Of course, it didn't solve the problems because it was only focusing on 20% of the solution, changing companies instead of systems. It wouldn't be hard to modify ESG to drive system change. All we have to do is take current models that companies are already using, add system change metrics to them. Then if we begin to give companies scores on their system change performance, we reward those financial institutions and companies that drive system change and penalize those that block it. We also make the business case and show how by doing this, you'll be investing in smarter, better managed companies that are going to make more money in the short and the long term. So that's what we call system change investing. I think it's a way to engage the capital markets in driving system change.
Sure. Excellent points, with the exception, of course, that, as you know, in some jurisdictions, you cannot utter the acronym ESG and be safe, at least from some of the regulators and some of the courts. But this could be another discussion, definitely. But the substance of it is very much as you eloquently put it. Thank you. So in the remaining minutes, I like to, well, many of you mentioned different ways the importance of equity. So I like to be doing that, at least with the time remaining with the panelists. So Stefan, you have a couple of minutes to share with Dragan and Ketan.
Yeah, I will take Frank's and Ketan's argument. I just had an intimate meeting with the insurance companies here in Europe, right? And the argument is, if we don't address negative spillovers and negative systemic risks sooner than later in an unconventional way, large regions and large sectors are simply becoming uninsurable, like we see in LA at the moment. And uninsurability leads to uninvestable. And uninvestable means that financial assets, from normal credit lines to loans to mortgages to derivatives to ABS to hundreds of others, are ceased to exist because they don't make sense, right? Meaning, if we don't address these systemic issues, Frank is pointing out, and Ketan and Dragan, with an unconventional way, and one way to do it is actually the way with the Green QE, we actually end up in a system where financial services become less relevant than they were so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Excellent. Dragan?
Nobody can find the magic formula to integrate multi-track approach and made weights for some tracks. But definitely is true from my perspective that investments in green transition have to earn positive return profile. This is the name of the game. It depends on calculation of indirect costs, positive and negative externalities and something like that. But this is the matter of international financial organization and the intention to stimulate this kind of investments. But definitely it's true that positive return profile must be the rule of the game in such kind of investment. Probably following this idea, the European Union released in February so-called Antwerp Declaration. It is actually the EU Green Reindustrialization Plan, opposite the EU Green New Deal a couple of years before. Which means that the Europe is ready to invest in new industries, energy, decarbonized industries and other industries without carbon emission. So this is a typical example of so-called normative approach. This is not consequence of the game of market forces. This is something that Frank emphatically said, systemic change in the mindset, and not only in mindset, but also in mindsetting. Because without mindset doesn't make sense.
Right.
So about dialogue of new industrialization, dialogue past, we have new reality. We have 1 trillion planned for new industrialization in decarbonization and in energy and other related industries in Europe. This is typical example of structural approach in new economic rules.
Right. Thank you so much. Well, we're running out of time, but we have Ketan to respond and perhaps.
Don't worry, I'm going to be very brief, Mahmoud.
Yeah,
so
please go ahead.
I'm going to say that there is an answer, and it's somewhat different perhaps from the answer we've discussed. I think one, and it draws on some of the things that everyone has said, which is one, we're not accounting for the real cost and impact we make on the planet. So the first part is we have to change the accounting to take into account the proper and full costs of the impact on the environment. The markets will not mind that because they know how to make money regardless of how we account for things.
Sorry to interrupt. Will that be resolved, Ketan, will that be resolved at least partially by the Beyond GDP project that is led by?
Partly. I think it actually goes down to changing the accounting system of how we account for the impact on the environment, which there are many UN bodies and others working on. But we need to account for the impact. And if we do, then it will change industrial behaviors and activities, because many of them are actually deeply unprofitable to do, and they feed off a zero cost for the damage they do to the environment. And we don't value the assets well. So that's one part. The second is we keep thinking that the answer is some sort of public-private partnership on finance and blended finance. It isn't. The answer is the markets. The markets have $250 trillion. They're the only ones capable of funding the change. And so if we change the accounting, they are incentivized to fund the things that actually are truly profitable, not profitable because we have a Mickey Mouse accounting system. The third is we have global solutions in one part of the world that we cannot transfer to another part of the world because the conditions and policies in the other part of the world are not suited.
Nice.
So global solutions rollout plus policy change where the environment is conducive to these solutions being implemented is a big one. And the fourth is in some ways the most difficult but the most obvious, which is the function of a financial system at any point in human history has been to fund enterprise, transitions, great powers, great shifts in the world. And so we need to embrace the transition to the information era and far more boldly fund AI, quantum mechanics, fusion, huge data, and make sure it is not used to colonize people's minds, but is used to actually create benefits. And that requires some rule setting, but embracing the transition and speeding it up, because the longer we're in the midst of a transition that we haven't realized, the more chance we have social political unrest and economic unrest, and we're in conflict. So we need to embrace this and speed this up. And there's a massive opportunity for the world in that.
Yeah, this is well said. Thank you so much, Ketan. And this is fine to end with this positive direction toward the future. The audience and the followers of the discussion may agree with me that this has been an excellent panel. I know that we're all victims of the time constraints. Some of the issues needed more time, and I bet they will have more opportunities through WAAS to do more on the discussions on highlighting the practical solutions. But we're not alone in discussing all of these important elements. As I mentioned, the Finance for Development Conference in Seville concluded with a consensus on direction for the next 10 years to support the sustainability at large and the Sustainable Development Goals on the 2030 agenda. And part of what they agreed on, all of the membership of the UN but one, they said, we commit to continued reform of international financial architecture, enhancing its resilience, coherence, and effectiveness in responding to present and future challenges and crises. To better reflect today's realities, we commit to make global economic governance more inclusive, representative, equitable, and effective. We will strengthen the roles of the United Nations and the rest of the institutions working in that architecture. Anyways, I think there are many platforms, including this one and the Finance for Development platform, that can really take these discussions and the great lines of wisdom and pillars of wisdom that we have really gained from the excellent 4 panelists today for a better future than the one that is being envisioned if we're not doing what we should really be doing. Thank you so much, and very grateful to the time and your great insights. Thank you so much.